Vikings. The very name conjures up images of hit-and-run raids from across the water. But in 865 AD, the Vikings came not just to raid, but to conquer. So exciting, this might be the first evidence of a Viking winter camp in Britain. This was an army, and it would change Britain forever, laying siege to towns and killing kings.
Edmund at that point is still alive, he's unchained from the tree, and he is beheaded.
In this programme, I join bioarchaeologist Kat Jarman as we go in search of the traces left behind by this conquering Viking army. It's one of the epic stories of British history. The attempt in the 9th century by the Vikings to conquer the kingdoms of England, culminating in the battle between Alfred the Great's Wessex and the Viking army. I'm going to go on a journey across the country with the Viking expert Dr. Kat Jarman, and together we're going to be in the footsteps of what contemporaries called the Great Heathen Army. Hey Kat Jarman.
Hi Dan.
How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
This is exciting, eh? The Viking world we're looking at here.
Yeah.
I mean, is that a useful way to think about people, Vikings? I mean, are we just basically talking about people from what we now call Scandinavia?
Basically, yes, but unfortunately we don't really have a much better word to use. So at the moment, Vikings is really the best that we've got. So we're talking about the people who come from Scandinavia, starting these raids, movement out to, well, really, this whole region, going as far west as Iceland, Greenland, North America, obviously attacking England and the rest of northwestern Europe, but also all the way down here, so all the way down the rivers of Eastern Europe, down to the Black Sea, and possibly even further east.
So we've got people from here raiding up and down the coast, a definite nuisance, but when does that change into something more threatening, like conquest?
So around about the 850s, we start finding out that they're actually not just doing quick raids and going back again, but we have records to suggest that they're actually staying over winter.
With the Vikings, it's hard to separate out myth from reality. Icelandic sagas talk of an army led by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, now made famous by the Vikings TV series. These sons had wonderful names like Ivar the Boneless and Bjorn Ironside. But the sagas were written centuries after the events they describe. They're more like legends than history. Fortunately, there is a more reliable document.
So the key source in all of this really is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and that chronicles year by year the activities and the raids of the Vikings. So we first hear in the 850s that they're over winter, and then something changes in 865. We hear there's something called a Great Army appearing in East Anglia. So we're now very much focused here in the east of England.
So the geography's changed so much since then, but you know, someone like King's Lynn or Great Yarmouth, they land, okay, and then they're here to stay.
Yeah, so the only thing really we know is that they're somewhere here in East Anglia, we don't know. What we have from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is the record for that year. And it says, and the same year, a great raiding army came to the land of the English and took winter quarters in East Anglia and were provided with horses there, and they made peace with them. So actually they get supplies, they get horses, and then somehow they manage to convince essentially the locals that they're allowed to stay.
I think I can imagine how that convincing process went. England at this time was divided into 4 main kingdoms. East Anglia, ruled by King Edmund. The Vikings had already encountered him and managed to negotiate a peace for now. Mercia, ruled by King Burgred. Wessex, where Alfred the Great would soon become king. And Northumbria, which was in the midst of a civil war. These disunited kingdoms were ill prepared for what they were about to face. Okay, so we've got some Vikings in East Anglia. Worryingly, they've now got horses. What do they do with them?
So according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, they now start moving around, and they've got this seasonal warfare. So they go to a new place, and then they overwinter and camp out. So one of the first places they go to is York.
Okay. Up the A1, up the Roman road to York.
Yeah, so they are probably using a lot of these Roman roads and a lot of other sort of really quite useful access places. And they're also really good at taking advantage of some of the internal warfare going on. So there's a lot happening in Northumbria and in York at the time.
That's a really good point, because Britain is divided like at no other time in its 2,000-year history. You've got various things going up in what is now Scotland, lots of little principalities in Wales, Northumbria here, Cumbria, Mercia, it's all divided up.
Absolutely, so you've got these separate kingdoms.
The first kingdom to face the full wrath of the Vikings is Northumbria. The army, probably consisting of several thousand warriors, heads north, and in the year 866, they reach York. One of the major cities of England, probably one of the top 5 most important cities of England, is now in the hands of the Vikings.
Exactly.
The Anglo-Saxon chronicles give us a dramatic account.
Breaking open the town, some of them entered in. Then there was an immense slaughter of the Northumbrians, some within and some without. Both the kings were slain on the spot.
But although the history tells us that the Great Heathen Army was here, no traces of that army have ever been found. But in 870, the Vikings leave York and return to East Anglia. And here we can finally pick up the trail of the Great Heathen Army. So I love this place. We're in Thetford, little other nondescript market town in Norfolk, but look at this place, unbelievable. That's a gigantic Iron Age and Norman fortification.
Yeah, and what's so exciting here is that this may well be that first place where we've got the documentary evidence for a Viking camp and possibly also some archaeology.
No way, we can see why. I mean, you've got the giant Iron Age fortifications, ramparts. You've got a later Norman motte in the middle, so the Iron Age tribes thought this place was important. The Normans certainly did, so the Vikings may well have done as well.
Yeah, I think that's part of the key. It's finding those places that made sense for a lot of people, and they would have made a lot of sense for the Vikings as well.
So we're quite close to the North Sea here. When do you reckon the Vikings head inland and set up camp here?
Well, we definitely know that they came to Thetford in the 869 to 870 overwintering, but we know in 865 that they were in East Anglia as well, and it's quite possible that this was the same location that they came to that first year. We just don't have the evidence for it yet, but quite often it would make sense to come back to the same location later on.
This could be the place where they met King Edmund, they asked those horses, and they set off into the heart of Britain.
Quite possibly.
Right, let's head up to the old Norman motte, take a look. Do you think they often used Iron Age hill forts, so-called, as defensive structures?
Quite possibly. So all we really know is from the records that they certainly had fortifications, and it would make an awful lot of sense to use something that was already there, something that was ready-made essentially, rather than making your own.
Definitely. So lots of Viking objects found just over there. God, that's so exciting. This might be the first evidence of a Viking winter camp in Britain.
Possibly, yeah. So it'd be great if we could actually associate these with them. So this, for example, is a sword that was found with a burial in that housing estate over here.
Lovely.
And then a bit further down, other excavations uncovered lots of fragments of weapons, including these arrowheads. And one of these is of a type that was not really used in England at the time, but it was used in Scandinavia.
Right, okay, that's good enough for me.
Yeah.
And what's going on? What's the point of a winter camp? Why are they staying there for ages and dropping things? Why don't they get attacking?
Yeah, this seems to be a very deliberate strategy, and what the reason for that really is that you have some time to catch up, to repair your weapons, to repair your ships if you've got a ship army as well, get any resources that you need. And as we well know, winter is not the nicest time to drag a force of thousands through the muddy English landscape.
Yeah, the roads, the tracks turn into
exactly.
miles,
So it makes sense for an awful lot of reasons, and you sort of regroup. Maybe you get new people joining the force.
Reinforcements could come in from Scandinavia. The North Sea coast is really pretty close to here.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know from those records in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that There are several points when the Great Army gets reinforcements, so several forces join it, and so they get strengthened and for whatever purpose.
This is so different to the Vikings that have just come to raid and then go home again. This feels like the beginnings of, well, occupation. Do you think this is temporary or is this something more permanent?
We know that some of it is temporary, so they have these camps and they move around the country, but actually there's quite a lot of evidence that this is the first stage of a settlement process. So some of them clearly do stay and they intend to leave something permanent behind and have essentially a new life here.
This is the beginning of the Viking conquest.
Absolutely.
And in the forest not far away, Kat thinks there might be evidence of that more permanent Viking presence.
So you haven't been here before?
No, this is the first time, but I've wanted to come here for a very long time.
Why do you think there's Viking activity in this terrain here?
We're not very far from Thetford here, but in 1857 some workmen found a Viking grave, or possibly a Viking double grave, really close to here in Santon Downham. So that's just around the corner. We know we've got the camps. And then what's really interesting is if you look at the maps, there's actually an awful lot of mounds in this area, and nobody's really looked at those. There is a chance that some of those could be Viking as well.
So we're looking for mounds in here. See that? There's a huge, should we try and have it, should we go off-road here? Should we go and check this out?
The maps, there are maps show that definitely in this area.
Trouble is, it's difficult to see, isn't it?
Yeah, so this forest was planted very recently and it kind of hides pretty much everything. Yeah, I think this might be it.
Yeah, it definitely feels like this could be a mound. A big one, actually, a really big one. So is this typical of how the Vikings buried their dead, right across the Viking world?
Yeah, so especially in Scandinavia, we do see burial mounds as one of the most common forms of burial. We also do have them at a very sort of select number of places in England, and in particular right next to one of the most significant Viking camps.
So what's it mean that all these little mounds that we've always seen on the map and noticed as we strolled past might actually be Viking burial mounds?
One of the big questions, and one of the things we haven't quite worked out, is how these raiders really turned to settlers. We know that we've got, really huge numbers, tens of thousands of Scandinavians settling in this country, but that sort of transition, those early phases especially, we don't really know very much about them. So if we can start to understand, start to find those graves, start to find out who those people were and what they did, where they lived, then perhaps we can find that sort of missing link between raiding and settlement.
Yeah, I guess the Great Heathen Army didn't leave behind a huge footprint, but what if it was hiding in plain sight and we'd just all been walking past their graves all along?
Absolutely, and I think it's really worth going back and reinvestigating some of those sites.
Get your trowel out.
But before we leave, there's another mystery I want to investigate. What became of Edmund, King of East Anglia? To find out, we've come to the beautiful cathedral town of Bury St Edmunds.
So I've always wondered, is Bury St Edmunds named after the King Edmund that you mentioned who gave the horses to the Great Heathen Army?
Yeah, that's the one. So he was the one who struck a deal with the Great Army when they first arrived in 865. They then went to the north, they went to York, into Northumbria, went into Mercia, and then we get to 869 and they come back here, they come back to East Anglia again.
So he must have been disappointed to see them back. Surely his calculation was that the Northumbrians and the Mercians would deal with these marauding heathens.
Yeah, I imagine so. And we don't know what the terms of the agreement was either, so we don't know what that was and what went wrong. But when they do come back, something breaks down quite quickly, it goes terribly wrong, and it doesn't end well for Edmund at all.
So he ends up fighting the Vikings?
Yeah, so we end up with a battle between the Vikings and Edmund. Edmund loses, and very soon after he also loses his life.
Where's he buried?
Well, he was lost for a very long time, but we now think we might know where he is.
Is it in Bury St Edmunds?
It might be.
Francis Young is a historian and author who spent years trying to find out what really happened to St Edmund by studying the historical documents.
We have the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle as our earliest source, written about 30 years after the event. And the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle says that the Danes won the battle, and killed the king, in that order. What you would normally have in a source like that is you'd say that they killed the king and therefore won the battle. So the fact that the king is killed after the battle suggests that it may well be a separate event. We then have a much later source from over a century later. That's the Passion of St Edmund by a monk called Abbot of Fleury. And that's the story that gives us for the first time details about how Edmund supposedly died. That the Danes actually capture him not at the battle, but fleeing away from the battle at a place called Hegelsdune. We don't know where that was, but somewhere in his kingdom at a royal estate. And at Hegelsdune, a debate takes place in which Edmund decides that he's not going to rule as a puppet king under these heathens unless they convert to Christianity. When they then refuse to convert to Christianity, when they capture him, he then says, well, I would rather die for Christ. And so that's when he is beaten, he is chained up, he's tied to a tree. The Danes then use him as target practice for their archers. Edmund at that point is still alive, he's unchained from the tree, and he is beheaded. And his head, as a final act of ignominy, is thrown into the bushes so that his followers can't find it again. Edmund's body is simply left by the Vikings. The local people come and they take his headless body and they bury it nearby. But what then happens is, according to the hagiography, the miracle account, is we have this extraordinary story about how his followers, sometime afterward, are searching in the undergrowth, trying to find that head. And they hear a voice shouting very clearly, "Here, here, here!" And they don't know who it is who's shouting, and they follow the voice, and they find, in a clearing in the wood, a gigantic wolf holding between its paws the severed head of the king, which is undecayed, and as it was when it was beheaded. And it's the head itself that, according to this account, God has given miraculous power to shout and find its location. They then take the head back to the body, the wolf following, which has become tame by another miracle, and then the body is exhumed, the head is attached to the body, both parts of the body are incorrupt, have not decayed, and the head and body miraculously reunite, leaving only a thin red line to mark where the martyr had been killed. And yeah, one of the miracle accounts that comes back again and again with St Edmund is the idea that his body does not decay, it is an incorrupt corpse.
Soon, the martyred king became the focus of a religious community. And an imposing place of worship was built in his honour, St Edmund's Abbey.
Astonishing, isn't it?
It is
Some
beautiful.
dramatic ruins. This is the Norman transept of the giant monastery they built here, I guess. He must
Yeah.
have been a big deal.
He was for a very long time, and he was one of the earliest patron saints of England, and he was venerated for his martyrdom against the Danes for centuries. And
A bigger deal is after death than he was during his life.
yeah, definitely, we actually don't really know that much about his life.
The most interesting part of Edmund's life is what happens after his death, is what several scholars have observed. And yes, Edmund continues, according to the hagiographical accounts, to perform these miracles. So we have extraordinary miracles at Bury, particularly, where he begins to become a rather scary saint, a very vengeful figure who does not take kindly to anybody meddling with his shrine or his church in any way. His body is moved to the Church of St Mary in Bury St Edmunds, which is at that time a wooden church, and his shrine soon becomes a magnet for pilgrims who donate gold and other rich offerings to that shrine. And so it becomes very attractive to thieves. And we have early examples of people attempting to rob it at night, and Edmund simply freezes them in their place so that they are unable to move. We have other examples of miracles where his hair and his fingernails continue to grow after death and are cut by a holy woman called Oswin, who looks after the body, so another sign of the body being completely incorrupt. We have examples of people being punished when they try to touch the body of St Edmund. One of the early abbots of Bury St Edmunds attempts to find out whether Edmund's head is properly attached to his body, having looked at that miracle account about how the two had miraculously joined. And so he asks another monk called Thurstan to hold the feet while the abbot, Leofstan, holds the head. But it's such an impious act that God and St Edmund punishes Leofstan by striking him down with a palsy that affects him for the rest of his life. And so no one ever tries that one again.
With these reported miracles, Edmund's fame grows stronger.
His importance for the whole country, or for the whole sort of England really, is part of the reason why this whole site grew to the size it did.
Yeah, no, it's a massive monastery, isn't it? What about Edmund himself? He was at the heart of it. What happened to him?
So his bones, his body was moved here quite soon after his death, and his relics remained here, and they became a site of pilgrimage for a very, very long time. And in fact, they probably stayed here until about the 16th century, at which point they were lost.
So a classic case, Henry VIII dissolves the monastery, 16th century, they're all stripped, the roofs are taken off, the stones all ripped out to be used around the rest of the town. And the old kings of England, like in Winchester, they're all sort of scattered to the winds.
Yeah, so we don't know exactly what's happened, but clearly they disappear. So for a very, very long time, the bones of Edmund were completely lost. But now we think that we might know where he might be.
It's very unlikely that the body of Edmund was destroyed. The bodies of saints were not generally destroyed. There's one possible exception to that, which was Thomas Becket. But in the case of Edmund, as a royal king, his body would have been treated with some degree of decency and respect. And in fact, it's very likely it would have been left up to the monks. We have a later source from the 17th century, which claims to be an account of how a grandfather of a 17th century monk in France had been a monk of Bury St Edmunds, and that grandfather monk, who had children after he ceased to be a monk after dissolution, that he was responsible with a number of other monks for taking the body of St Edmund, placing it in a great iron chest and putting it somewhere in the abbey precincts. And that's the only account that we have. It doesn't go into any more detail than that. So all we can say is that this account may be reliable. It's the oldest account that we have, but it gives us a hint of what may possibly have occurred.
So there's a chance that actually at the point that he was reburied in the 16th century, right here we're now in the crypt of the old abbey, and on the other side here is the old monks' cemetery, and there is a source that suggests he was actually put into an iron coffin and buried somewhere right here.
Oh my gosh, that's so exciting. So we've got another king in the car park situation here.
Pretty much, because this actually used to be a tennis court until last year, so we had a
King under the tennis court.
Yeah.
If you walk round to the end of the ruined crypt, which is at the very east end of that huge Norman Abbey church, you'll find a raised area of grass. Until very recently, it was the site of some tennis courts. However, today those tennis courts have been cleared away, and we hope that at some point in the fairly near future, there will be some sort of archaeological investigation into that area, not only to potentially look for St Edmund, but also to look at those monastic burials, which have never been investigated. Because there was a tennis court on this from quite an early date, the earlier excavations of the abbey never looked at this area. And so now it's available for potential investigation.
I'm getting a bit overexcited here, but we are now within metres of the hapless King Edmund, a man killed by the Great Heathen Army, Saint Edmund, still buried in Bury St Edmunds.
Maybe.
Such a downer.
At last, we're on the trail of the Heathen Army. But the archaeology is still elusive. It's time to go back to our HQ to plan our next move.
So we realise it is hard to find the archaeological, the physical footprints of this Great Heathen Army. It's so tantalising, isn't it? Because we've got little fragments of information.
Yeah, so especially in that early phase, we've got so little evidence, so it is really, really difficult. And it gets even worse because we have all these battles referred to. So when they move on from East Anglia, they actually go to Readings. And that year, there's an awful lot of battles. There's sort of 7, 8, 9 different battles happening. But we haven't found any of them, so we don't know where they were, even though the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle actually explains that thousands die. We still don't know.
Battlefields, I can imagine, are really difficult to find. Sometimes the action might only be, well, minutes long, possibly a couple of hours. But the camps where they're spending their winter, they're dropping more stuff there, surely. They're doing more earth moving. It must be a bit easier.
Yeah, so quite early on, a lot of the hunt for these camps was in looking for fortifications. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle often mentions that they have fortifications. So great big earthworks you should be able to see, right? So that was a lot of the early search. But then more recently, new methods have shown that actually there are different ways. They didn't always build earthworks. And in fact, exactly what you say, that the objects that are being dropped, the sort of random rubbish that they leave behind, is one of the key ways that we've been able to find them. So a really important site is where they go next after Reading. So that's Torksey in Lincolnshire. So if we try and find it just about here.
Wow, there's a very distinctive bend in the river there.
Yeah, and so as you can see, it's really wide here. It's really easy to get down from the Humber by boat. And what happened here was that quite recently, a lot of metal detecting finds were discovered in exactly these fields, so right by the sort of bend in the river. And actually later archaeological work showed that at the time, this was an island. So the Trent was really much more water, much higher. So it was as a proper sort of isolated location. So they probably didn't need the fortifications, they didn't need the earthworks, it was naturally defended.
But ideal place to spend the winter.
Absolutely. And the key really there was realising the sort of finds that were essentially a kind of signature or a fingerprint of the Great Army, the sort of things they left behind.
Something that's proven invaluable in the hunt for Vikings is the Portable Antiquities Scheme. Through this scheme, metal detectorists can report objects they've found. With over 1.5 million finds recorded, archaeologists can search for patterns that would otherwise be missed.
So one of the key types of objects are these little things here. So these are from a different site. These are
What are these?
little gaming pieces.
This is a Viking gaming piece?
Yes.
Like a chess piece or something like that?
Yeah, like a sort of checkers or something
Wow.
like that. And they found them in really, really huge numbers at Torksey, along with various other types of artifacts that we know are very specific to the Vikings. So it's things like weights from trading and weighing systems as well. And later archaeological work has even shown things like ship nails coming up there. So all of this now essentially has become our sort of fingerprint, as it were, for searching for the Great Army. So this site and the work done here really revolutionised the search, and we've been able to use that now to look at the rest of the country.
So when metal detectorists elsewhere in the country are turning up these kind of objects, you're like, Great Heathen Army.
Yeah, pretty much seems so. We don't know how long they are being used for, but it seems like Torksey is the first place that they definitely start using these. So looking at the distribution, we can then start to look at the patterns.
Yeah, I don't want to drop that priceless Viking artefact. It makes me very nervous. Right, where are we going after Torksey then? Where does the Great Heathen Army go now? Does it follow the Trent into the heart of England?
Absolutely. So now, this year, apparently they make peace with the Mercians. So now we're looking at the Kingdom of Mercia. And it seems that after this point, they are looking for the jewel in the crown of the Mercian kingdom, which is the site of Repton.
The jewel in the crown. That sounds like a must visit. It's back on the road to Repton in Derbyshire.
I know it's silly, but when I visit places that were at the centre of kind of bloody, dramatic events in our history, even though it's more than 1,000 years ago, I still feel like it should be like that today, but of course now it just feels like a lovely, beautiful country church.
Yeah, this sort of feels like as idyllic as you can get in England, doesn't it, really? But it definitely was not like that in the late 9th century.
It was an important place, not the Vikings obviously had a huge impact here, but it was an important place well before they arrived. In fact, that's what they were doing here, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. So even before the Viking Age, this was one of the most significant sites really in the Kingdom of Mercia. This was of royal, ecclesiastical, religious importance. There was a very wealthy monastery here dating back probably as early as the 7th century.
Does any of that fabric still remain, or was it all smashed up by the Vikings?
So we know definitely some of it was destroyed by the Vikings, but there is a part that still remains, that the crypt. I mean, most of the churches is very modern, but there are still...
You're the only person I know, Kat, who refers to very modern as the 14th century.
Yeah, well, you know, anything after the turn of the millennium is pretty much modern to me.
Which millennium? So we're heading down to the crypt.
Yeah, this is the Anglo-Saxon crypt.
And this is Anglo-Saxon now, these rocks here. I'm like, whoa.
So this here, definitely, when we're now in the crypt, this is all part of the Mercian monastery.
Amazing. Time travel.
Yeah, absolutely. This is what's so extraordinary. This is what was here when the Vikings arrived. They would be touching the same pillars that we're touching today.
And that's pretty unusual in Britain, isn't it? There's not much stone architecture left from the 9th century, but this is a bit older.
Yeah, so this is 8th century, certainly, possibly even before that. So there's not much of that at all. So it's very rare in the whole country to have evidence of that remaining.
This is one of the most special early medieval bits of architecture in the UK.
Yeah, definitely. And what's really nice as well is you can see things like traces of paint. So if you
So
imagine
it would have
it,
been coloured.
yeah, imagine it really vividly coloured, full of jewels, glittering gold, candles. It must have been such an atmospheric place. I mean, it's special today, but more than 1,000 years ago, even more so.
And so this is where Mercia, which had been one of the most powerful Anglo-Saxon kingdom for periods, buried its kings. I mean, this was the holiest of the holy.
Yeah, so we know that several of the Mercian dynasty, the royal dynasty, were buried here, and this crypt itself would have been that mausoleum. So this would have been where those, possibly in these alcoves here, would have had essentially the remains of those kings, and people would come here as a pilgrimage, somewhere to visit. And this was all part of the bigger monastery site, which was very wealthy. It was a double house monastery for men and women. So it might have been a small town around it as well.
So this is, you can't really talk about things as a capital city, I guess, but this would have been one of the most important religious, political, royal sites in Mercia.
Absolutely, and this would have been known far and wide, so a very deliberate place for the Vikings to attack. So this would have been filled with all sorts of riches. So there'd be a lot that they could take away, a lot of wealth here. But it was much more than that. It was very much a political statement, knowing that it was such an important religious site. If you come and take that, then you're making a really big statement.
This is like the Soviets sticking their kind of hammer and sickle flag on the Reichstag in 1945. What an amazing moment.
We know about the Viking presence here thanks to the extraordinary investigations done here by Professor Martin Biddle and his late wife, Beate Scholby Biddle.
From 1974, we started to dig beside the crypt, and very early on we got dating evidence, and then we found an enormous ditch. I mean, a whopper right beside the church. And if you can imagine the church was there, the sort of angle of the church, the ditch was there. They were corner to corner. And this is 4 meters deep, goodness knows how wide. We only got part of it. And we started to think, and we looked at the kind of pottery, not much, that was coming out of it. And it came to us that there was only one thing this could be. It would be part of the Viking winter camp of 873-4, which of course we know about from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle.
And Martin Biddle and his team didn't only find the ditch around the church, they found other evidence that proves the Vikings were here.
So what else have you found at this site?
So in addition to the ditch and all of that, the archaeologists excavating here in the 1970s and 80s found a lot of burials, and some of them were definitely Scandinavian or Viking burials, and actually they are right here, and some of the most important
right
ones.
Here?
Yeah, so we're just going to try and work out exactly where we are. So looking at the map and the plan. So this is the church as it is, that's the crypt.
Yeah.
7 and 8, this is the most
They're
important.
right in here, aren't they?
Yeah, this spot that we're standing on now
Yeah.
is probably the best known and most significant Viking grave in all of England.
Right.
This was where we had the so-called Repton warrior buried, and a younger man next to him. He was buried with a lot of objects, which was a typical Scandinavian burial rite, of being buried with objects around you. That included a sword along his side, a Viking sword. He had a Thor's hammer around his neck.
Yes, Thor's hammer around his neck.
Yeah.
The guy's a Viking.
Precisely. So that's the sort of most obvious part of it. He had lots of other smaller objects, but he also had some really, really severe injuries on his body. So we could be pretty confident. I mean, it's difficult to say this idea of whether somebody's a warrior is really hard. Even if you're buried with weapons, doesn't necessarily mean that. But the severity of his injuries, he must have died in battle.
So he was terribly wounded or killed in battle and brought back here to this sacred royal space to be buried.
Absolutely. So he was here, there was a younger man next to him, and we actually now know through DNA analysis that they were related. So they were father and son. They were essentially buried side by side, and on top of them were lots of stones, a sort of rectangular stone setting, which included smashed up pieces of beautiful carved Anglo-Saxon crosses. So here you have what seems to be a pagan burial with weapons, with Thor's hammer, and with essentially the evidence of that smashed up monastery right on top.
Anything else in the body you want to tell me about?
Well, there is a very, I know exactly what you're asking about. He had some quite severe injuries, as I said. One of them was a very big wound to his left femur, his left thigh bone, almost certainly made by an axe because it was a properly big V-shaped cut. But he went so closely down diagonal from his left hip that it's almost certain that it would have cut off part of his penis as well. More evidence for the likelihood of that is that those who buried him actually placed a boar's tusk in between his legs.
Right, so he could still enjoy life to the full in the afterlife.
Presumably that was the reason.
And why? I mean, that map's fascinating. There's just a cluster of burials right here, just outside the royal crypt. What statement are the Vikings trying to make there?
Yeah, I think that's the really key point here in Repton. This isn't a coincidence. This isn't just something that they do and then move away and forget all about. They are using burial, those funerary rites, as a very political statement, saying this is where you used to have your royals, your most important people, but now we're in control, we're in charge, and these are our important dead. So now we have that link that we can show even the next generations that this is now essentially Scandinavian territory.
And an even more dramatic burial is to be found next door.
So we come to the vicarage garden just next to the church now. More evidence here, is there?
Yeah, so this is another one of those locations, in fact if we go over here, where one of those discoveries was made in the 1980s. Back in the 80s there was a mound here.
Okay.
And that mound had been known about for a very long time. In fact, it had been dug into by antiquarians.
Pesky antiquarians.
Yeah, absolutely. They dug holes into it. And in fact, there's a record that dates to the early 1700s of somebody who'd been asked by the lady of the manor house that used to be behind us here, to investigate hillocks in the garden. And this workman had dug into it and found this huge deposit of bones. Wow. There was a central skeleton, 9 foot tall, surrounded by the bodies of 100 humane skeletons, apparently. But the lady of the manor was so horrified by this that she just ordered them to cover it all up again. So back in the 1980s, this was excavated again, this mound, and they actually found that bone deposit. But it was inside a building, so it was inside a 2-celled stone building, which again was part of that same monastery, same period that the crypt was from, just basically right where we're standing now.
And it was just full of bones?
It was. One compartment was full of bones. They identified almost 300 individuals, all crammed into that single space.
Wow. And do we know that that's Viking era?
So there's quite a few clues within those bones. We know that they were all what we call secondary deposits. So they were bones that were buried somewhere else originally, and then they were moved when they turned to skeletons and put in place. But among the bones were also lots of artefacts. So there were Viking weapons, also coins dating to the 870s. So precisely that winter we know the Viking Great Army was here in Repton.
That's pretty good evidence, isn't it?
Yeah, that's pretty good as you go for evidence.
Is that bodies that people who died on the campaign, they kept them all and buried them in one place?
This is one of the big questions, and I think that that's what's most likely, because we would have had hundreds, maybe thousands of people dying on those campaigns in battle or for other reasons. It's likely they may have been given a temporary burial somewhere at a site. But when they came here to Repton, we know that they took over the whole territory. So this was a long-term thing. So I think it's quite likely that they could have gone back, found some of those remains and taken them, given them essentially a communal burial somewhere like this, somewhere where they can say, well, this is where we've settled now, this is where we are to stay.
To try and understand more about the Viking army, Kat has been investigating what modern science can tell from the skeletons.
So these are some of the skulls from the charnel, the mass burial in Repton. These are some of the individuals that were excavated.
And since these were found in the 1980s, so many different scientific techniques have been developed. What can you now tell about these skeletons?
So we can tell quite a lot more. Initially, really, all they could do was look at things like the skull shape to determine whether they were male or female, what sort of age category. So they discovered that they were largely male, although we do also have some women in this grave. Most of them were very, very young, so up to about between 18 and 45 for most of them, not really any old people and not children. But that was kind of it. And there was also confusion about the dates, because they seemed to date to much before the Viking Age, actually, when they radiocarbon dated them. So that seemed to be a bit of a kind of anomaly. And for a while, these were thought not to be related to the Great Army at all, because those dates were too early.
But you put that right.
Yeah, so some of the work I've been doing is looking at those dates, because now we've got some really brilliant techniques for looking at things like diet and also where people came from. And it turned out that dating was all about actually the sort of diets that these people had. By looking at whether they were eating fish or not, I was able to correct essentially those early radiocarbon dates. Because what happens when you have a high marine diet, you incorporate some carbon that's much older into your body. Because otherwise, we've all got carbon, so we can radiocarbon date skeletons, we can, wood or anything like that. But that assumes that the carbon comes from the atmosphere, and that's what we sort of normally do. If you've eaten a lot of fish, then actually the carbon in your body, in your bones and your skin and hair and everything has been around for much, much longer, because carbon in oceans is essentially older than terrestrial carbon. So by correcting for that, finding out if these people ate fish, you can then correct the dates as well.
So we know they ate fish. What else can we tell about them? Do we know anything about where they were from?
Yeah, so the other thing I've been able to do is look at something called strontium and oxygen isotope analysis, because we are like walking diaries of our lives, of what the sort of food we eat, and also the places where we are growing up. We sort of take up those chemical signals in our teeth, especially as children. So when your teeth are forming in childhood, you take up oxygen and strontium that's very specific to that geographic environment in your teeth, and that remains there even 1,000 years after you're dead. So looking at these ones here, it showed that very few of them were local. So one of the early theories was that some of these could be local people who were killed by the Vikings, but actually very few of them would fit the local pattern. What was really striking was that they were really mixed, they were really varied. So they were not all from the same place. Some of them fit really, really well with inland Scandinavia and colder climates. And in fact, pretty much all of them could fit Scandinavia. We can't quite rule out and make a sort of absolutely certain conclusion, but they definitely fit with what we would expect from a mixed Viking army.
So these are young military-age men. It looks like they very possibly come from Scandinavia. They eat lots of fish. Feels like Viking army.
Yeah, it's really quite likely, and it does fit with that. But the one issue that a lot of people have had is the fact that we actually do also have some women among these bodies. So some of these skulls we know belong to women. This one here, that's a female skull.
Right.
So the question has always been, why, who were they, and what were they doing there? And one of the early theories was that these were essentially the local wives of the incoming Scandinavian men. And that was based on partially some of the sort of physical characteristics of the skulls, but also the idea that actually Viking armies didn't really have any women in them. It used to be thought that the women all stayed at home and only the men really took part in the migrations. We've now changed that completely in terms of what we understand about these Viking migrations, and actually a lot of women were also part of it, even probably some of these early armies.
And do we think women were there doing ancillary jobs, or do you think they might have been there as warriors themselves?
That's one of the big questions that we can't quite answer. I think if they were there, if they were part of the group, it would be silly to think that they weren't able to defend themselves or they weren't able to take part in the fighting to some degree. I don't think they necessarily had to be sort of specialised warriors. We do have some cases across the Viking world of women buried with weapons in quite high status graves. So that is a big debate, what they were doing there, if they were essentially professional fighters, or if they were actually just sort of hangers-on. I think the reality is probably somewhere in between. Some of them would be able to fight if they needed to. I don't think we can have them as just completely passive textile workers or whatever, fixing clothes and whatnot, but maybe somewhere in between.
There aren't only bones. The site of Repton has yielded a rich selection of artefacts.
So some of the most special ones, actually, I think. These are actually pieces of Anglo-Saxon window glass. So these are from the buildings, and if you pick them up and have a look, they are really, really beautiful. They're also cut, so you can see the really sharp corners on them here, which is where they would be cut. And actually, Anglo-Saxon coloured glass is really quite unusual at the time, so you would only get that in really high status buildings. And we're finding these in the fragmented parts of the camp. So it's quite nice to think of that as possibly evidence of the actual attack itself.
So the windows have been smashed out and just bits of glass have been, used around the camp for whatever.
Yeah, or just, ending up in the ditch, really. So there's things like that. We've also got some coins that date back to the 8th century. They're showing really how...
Pre-Viking coins.
Yeah, so things that, like these ones here.
There was a lot of money about.
There was quite a lot of money, I think, because this was a very wealthy site. This was a very wealthy monastery. It was one of the reasons why the Vikings attacked in the first place. The fact that we've got here, these are actually also, they're from Frisia, so they're from across the English Channel.
Okay.
So they are probably quite valuable at the time.
What else have we got?
These ones you'll recognise.
Gaming pieces.
Yes.
God, they are, as you say, they are identical.
Yep.
Wow.
So you get exactly the same thing. These are found, again, really close by where the Anglo-Saxon glass is. So that's again how we know that these are Viking objects. We even have a quite rare, quite unusual arrowhead.
Wow.
So that's, again, Scandinavian type arrowhead, so completely consistent with the idea of a Viking camp. So we've got some really, really nice things that relate to what was happening in the camp, possibly also telling us something about who was there. So there's things like this, which is one that was found back in the 80s, actually. And this is a spindle whirl for using for textiles.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so they're making clothes, repairing...
Yeah, or sails as well. Sails obviously really important. And then we have some things like this, which is very, very special, which show that these Vikings were part of some really big trading networks. So this is the bead that was found in the mass grave at Repton.
Wow.
Which is made of
that's beautiful, isn't
carnelian.
Now, what is carnelian?
So carnelian is a semi-precious stone. It's not found in England, and in fact, the most likely source of this bead is Gujarat in India.
Really?
And we're finding them across the Viking world quite suddenly. They start in about the late 9th century. And what they show us is that the Vikings who came to Repton were actually part of a much, much bigger trading network that goes across Scandinavia, all the way down the eastern river routes, and that includes the Great Army. So it sort of changes a little bit the idea that these were completely separate from the rest of the Viking world, but actually what we're looking at something that's part of a much bigger system.
Despite all this evidence, a mystery remains. The site of Repton just doesn't seem large enough for the whole heathen army. So now Kat has taken me to a field a few miles east of Repton, where she thinks she might have found the answer.
We used to think that the only camp, which is what was mentioned in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, is that there was a camp at Repton, and the evidence seemed to suggest that. But there's been a lot of questions about that. So one of them being, is it really big enough? Because that site is quite small. We now know from other sites that the Great Army probably numbered in the thousands. Could they all fit in that site? And there were certain things that didn't really turn up. We didn't have that many gaming pieces, no dirhams, that sort of thing. Then just a few years ago, a metal detectorist detecting around here actually made some discoveries and told me all about them. Turns out he'd found exactly the sort of thing that we were looking for. So gaming pieces, lots of broken up bits of jewellery, and even a Thor's hammer pendant and those dirham coins in the fields all around us here.
So very much like Torksey.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
Just the sort of thing. And if you look at the landscape, it actually makes a lot of sense. So as we were just saying, the floodplain is just down at the bottom here. And you can't necessarily make it out as you're driving through it, but if you look at something like the LiDAR, it's really blindingly obvious. And here we go, that's the church just behind us.
Yeah.
And if you zoom out,
Oh yeah, we're right on the edge of some much higher ground. That's the valley, the Trent Valley.
yeah, this is the floodplain. It's just really, really, really clear.
This is a 3D LiDAR model created by scanning a laser across the ground. It allows you to see not only the current landscape, but clues to what the landscape used to be. For instance, you can see the path of the river that used to run right by the church at Repton, explaining why the Viking camp was there.
You can see you've got the river coming along. That's where the river is today. You can just about make it out. So you got this really quite steep, almost like an escarpment just behind us here. And then as you go along, it starts to flatten out. And so it makes sense that you get a Viking camp in a place like this, because this is where you can pull up boats and have it essentially a bit like a beach. This must have been so full of people. You've got boats being pulled out of the river. You've probably got tents. We don't think they've got buildings and structures in these camps, so we think they're just very, very temporary. There's nothing in the geophysics, there's no real evidence of building. So you'll have tents, you'd have animals, you'd have horses, maybe even cattle at some of these places, food basically. And it would just be packed. A bit like somebody's made a comparison to a festival, like a music festival, just turning up and then disappearing again.
So in 873, this landscape might have resembled a kind of Viking Glastonbury, with thousands of warriors camped out for the winter. And just a few miles away, deep in the woods near Repton, there's another site that Kat can see on the LiDAR.
So yeah, so if you look at this is the woodlands. This is a path we've just come up here, this little triangle.
Yeah.
The woodland's very, very recent. So that was not
Only
there.
a few hundred years old.
Yeah, something like that.
Creepers.
But if you look,
Whoa,
if you zoom in,
those mounds are really...
yeah,
Oh
there
my
you go.
goodness.
That little cluster. So each
That's
mound
great.
is a Scandinavian burial, and there's a few others dotted around as well. 59 have been identified in total in this area. And it's interesting because if you look at this as well, you can see this is the highest ground by far, this
so
red
it is.
colour. It's likely that these were actually seen from the river, which is just down, you can see it dipping down.
Oh wow.
So they're placing their dead right up on the hill here. Anybody coming along by boat will see them. Anybody, I mean, possibly even down towards Repton, you might even be able to see up here.
Okay, so they're in here somewhere, are they?
It should
Some
be
high-
down this way.
It's exciting, isn't it? I can't believe it. I keep now, of course, everywhere I'm seeing mounds everywhere now. I've got to pull myself together. Where are they? Come on.
I think we're probably just around the corner. Let's try this way. The problem is obviously the trees and the vegetation make it much
Oh,
harder.
it's hellish, isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
this is
This
it,
is
isn't
it.
it?
This is it.
This is definitely moundy. Wow.
So this is what you could see on that LiDAR. And yeah, they're really clear actually.
God, that's amazing.
So these are all,
This is I just
Very
can't
nice.
believe this is a Viking burial site in the middle of Derbyshire. I love it. And so these have been excavated, have they?
some of them, not all of them. So I think most of these have not been excavated, but those that have been have shown that they were all cremation mounds. So there were cremations, most of them on the site itself. So you actually have the funeral pyre right there. Some of them have grave goods, things like weapons. We know that some of them had women in them as well, so both men and women. And there are some that are really intriguing because they seem to be empty when they were first dug up. And then they only found it as a small, almost like a little parcel of burnt bone. It's possible that those were graves of people who were cremated elsewhere and then taken and given a burial. So the bones were sort of moved into those mounds.
So this is on the very top of the highest hill for miles around, and they've had these cremation fires. Everyone will be able to see it. What a stunning setting it must have been for that ritual.
Yeah, I think it's quite important to think of that whole ritual, not just the mounds afterwards, but actually what that meant to those people in society, what signals, what messages were they sending out. And the location is really key, and you can just about through the trees over there see that we are dipping down, and without the trees, you would be able to see the river. Everybody would be able to see the mounds as well. So anybody coming down this route, this would have been blindingly obvious.
And really familiar to them from their Scandinavian lives.
I think so, and I think it's quite, because burial was used as a way of signalling identity as well, who you were, what your religion was and what your beliefs were. So I think that was one of the messages that people probably would have tried to get across.
We're back at HQ to continue the story.
So where does the Great Heathen Army go after making an absolute mess at Repton?
This was really a key point in the whole story of the Great Army, because after this year they split up and it's never one complete army again. So what happens here is that one part of it under Halfdan goes north, so they go into Northumbria and keep raiding around this sort of
back up here
area somewhere. Yeah, and we're looking for some new sites, and again, things like the gaming pieces actually give us some clues, so we may well have one of those sites coming up soon. And then the other half, which is under the leadership of Guthrum and two other kings called Arnund and Oscartel, they start going south and they go back towards the kingdom of Wessex.
Wessex is now ruled by Alfred the Great, one of the best known early kings. The part of the heathen army heading south is now led by the Scandinavian Guthrum. For 5 years, these two men engage in a game of cat and mouse, until 878, when the future of England would hang in the balance. Kat and I have come to this dramatic location in Wiltshire to find out how King Alfred finally took on the might of the invading Vikings.
He essentially decides to take the victory back and take his kingdom back. So he gathers up all the men he can get, and then they move up again and they come to this place called Ethandun or Eddington, so most likely just right here where we are now.
But we're not certain, are we? That's what's so tantalising. This could have been the site of this great climactic battle.
Yeah, so it's one of those that, because obviously we haven't found it for certain yet, there's no evidence of where it is. People have been coming up with all sorts of suggestions. There's quite a lot of places called Eddington as well, which doesn't really help. Yeah. And there's nothing in the records to really talk about the geography as such. So the question is then, where in the landscape, where would it make sense to have a battle? Again, we don't have any clues from the documents. So
what about your archaeological eye? Are there any humps and bumps around here? Anything you've picked out that you think might be connected to the battle?
So there's a lot going on in this landscape. It has been over a long period of time. There's quite a lot of prehistoric monuments. There's even mounds here that would look very much like those burial mounds.
So if Kat is right, this is the location of one of the most pivotal moments in British history. The Battle of Eddington, briefly described in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles.
King Alfred proceeds to Eddington and there fought with all the army and put them to flight, riding after them as far as the fortress.
So he basically chases them back, and it seems to be a really, really close call, because according to one of the records, he kills everybody outside, people who haven't been able to get to safety, so men, cattle, horses, everything that was outside the fortification. And they then hold up for 14 days until they presumably can't make it any longer from hunger or thirst or whatever.
And so that's the Viking surrender?
Pretty much. So they agree at that point to essentially give up. So they agree to leave his kingdom, and they promise to swear oaths, to give him hostages, and crucially they also promise that the King Guthrum, along with 30 of his best men, are going to be baptized. So they agree to go to Alfred a bit later on and become Christians, basically.
Well, that's literally the end of the Great Heathen Army. They're led by a bunch of Christians now.
Alfred and the Vikings sign a peace treaty that divides England between them. The influence of that deal survives to this day.
So this line here is the one agreed between Alfred and Guthrum?
Yeah, so that's the boundary in the treaty. And then these dots that we see here, these are all Scandinavian place names. So these are all settlements, villages, towns that have got some kind of Scandinavian element to them. And it's really quite obvious how there are practically none to the west of this. So in what was then Wessex, they're just not there. So they are settling in those territories. And that becomes a really, really important point. So even though the battles continue, there's still a lot of competition over these other territories. This really, what happens then after Eddington, on this treaty onwards, becomes such a decisive moment that is remembered for quite a long time afterwards.
So even when Alfred and his children, grandchildren started conquering eastern and northern England, the Viking, the Scandinavian place names, genes, the people, the customs, they would endure.
Absolutely. So the Scandinavians, from this point on especially, left a really lasting legacy on the whole of the country.
So the remains of the Great Heathen Army can be found all around us. Not just in the archaeological traces they left behind, but in names, customs and genes that have become part of the fabric of this country. The Viking invaders became settlers.